Welcome back to Reset 676. I'm Chandra Mel, and I'm narrating the works researched and written by Marek Czepiewski. Permission has been granted by the author to narrate this for a podcast. Everything that I am going to say in this podcast will be the direct quote of his works, unless I otherwise state. The biggest pandemic. The greatest catastrophe in human history was the Black Death. That is, the plague pandemic, which killed 75 to 200 million people. The dates for the beginning and the end of the pestilence are not clearly defined, but its greatest intensity was between 1347 and 1351. This is just before the end of the 52-year cycle. Interesting, isn't it? This cycle was known to the Mayans and Aztecs long before the plague broke out in Europe, and yet, somehow, they managed to hit the jackpot. Perhaps this is just a coincidence. The epidemic was just one of many problems that people had to deal with in those years. During the plague, there were also strong earthquakes. For example, on January 25th, 1348, the earthquake centered in Friuli, which is in northern Italy, was felt across Europe. Contemporary minds linked the quake with the Black Death, fueling fears that the biblical apocalypse had arrived. There were even more earthquakes at this time. In January 1349, yet another powerful earthquake shook the Apennine Peninsula. In March of the same year, there was also an earthquake in England, and in September in what is now Italy again. The latter resulted in serious damage to the Roman Colosseum. The chronicler's accounts, which I will describe in more detail in the chapter on the Black Death, tell that the series of calamities began with a great cataclysm in India in September 1347. Thus, the most turbulent period began about 3.5 years before the end of the calendar round and ended 2 years later. That is, about 1.5 years before its end. Was it just a coincidence that the plague occurred in these years? Or did the Aztecs possess some secret knowledge that we do not have? To find out, we need to look at other great cataclysms. If it is true that the gods try to destroy the earth every 52 years, then traces of these destructions should be traceable in history. Let's see if any other great historical cataclysm happened just before the end of the 52-year cycle. The probability that a particular catastrophe will happen just within this period by chance is minimal. The chance of it occurring in the same year of the cycle is as low as 1 in 52, or 2%. So we will quickly verify whether the coincidence of the plague with the Mayan calendar is just an accident or if it was something more than that. The biggest earthquake. So let's check in which year the largest earthquake occurred. That is, the one that claimed the greatest number of victims. It turns out that the record earthquake happened in the 16th century in Shanxi province in China. As many as 830,000 people died then. It was a total massacre, and we must remember that it happened at a time when there were over a dozen times fewer people in the world than there are today. The losses in relation to the world population were as great as if 13.6 million people had died today. This catastrophe occurred exactly on February 2nd, 1556. That is 3 years before the end of the calendar round. The likelihood that the biggest earthquake would happen by chance in the same year before the end of the cycle as the greatest pandemic was very low. And yet, by some miracle, it happened. Things are starting to get really interesting. The strongest volcanic eruption. Now let's look at some other kind of cataclysm. How about volcanic eruptions? The strength of volcanic eruptions is measured by the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI for short, a classification system that is somewhat akin to the magnitude scale for earthquakes. The scale ranges from 0 to 8, with each successive VEI degree 10 times greater than the previous one. 0 is the weakest explosion, almost imperceptible, and 8 is a mega colossal explosion that could change the climate all over the Earth and even lead to mass extinction of species. The most recent eruption of the highest degree occurred approximately 26.5 thousand years ago. Of course, it is not possible to determine its exact year. Therefore, let's consider only those eruptions for which the exact year is known. The most powerful eruption of this kind was that of the Indonesian volcano Tambora, which occurred about 200 years ago. It was not only the strongest outburst, but also the most tragic. An estimated 100,000 people perished from pyroclastic fallout or from subsequent starvation and disease. The strength of the eruption was rated at VEI 7, supercolossal. It exploded so loudly that it was heard over 2,000 kilometers, or 1,200 miles, away. It was probably the strongest eruption in the last few thousand years. The eruption of Tambora ejected thousands of tons of aerosols, sulfide gas compounds, into the upper atmosphere, which was the stratosphere. The high-level gases reflecting sunlight caused widespread cooling, known as volcanic winter, with heavy rains, snowfalls in June and July in the northern hemisphere, widespread crop failure, and subsequently famine. For this reason, the year following the eruption is known as the year without a summer. The Tambora volcano erupted on April 10, 1815. That was 3 years and 7 months before the end of the 52-year cycle. Another hit on the bullseye. I promise not to underestimate the Aztec gods anymore. Now, I'm starting to fear them. The probability of coincidence. Let's think calmly about what is actually going on here. Since time immemorial, Native Americans were carefully marking the 52-year cycles, believing that at some point before the end of the cycle, the gods might go berserk and destroy the earth. We know that all ancient cultures had some strange beliefs, but it just so happens that the dates of the historical catastrophes somehow confirm the beliefs of the ancient Americans. All 3 major disasters occurred in the same year of the 52-year cycle. Now, let's calculate the probability that this was just a coincidence. The cycle is 52 years long. The probability of the worst pandemic occurring just before the end of the cycle depends on how many of the years in the cycle are considered to be the end of the cycle. Let's assume that it is the last 5 years. In this case, the likelihood of hitting is 5 in 52, so 10%. And the chance of the biggest earthquake occurring in the same year of the cycle is 1 in 52, so 2%. But since the series of cataclysms during the Black Death lasted for 2 years, we should assume that the period of cataclysms also lasts for 2 years. According to these more conservative estimates, the chance of hitting the period of cataclysms is 2 in 52, or 4%. Let's now continue counting. The chance that the largest volcanic eruption will also occur during this 2-year period before the end of the cycle is again 2 in 52, 4%. Therefore, the probability of all 3 events occurring by chance during this period is the product of all the probabilities. So, it is equal to 5 divided by 52 multiplied by 2 divided by 52 multiplied by 2 divided by 52, which is 1 in 7,030. This is the probability that all 3 disasters occurred just by chance during this period. So it could not have been a coincidence. The Aztecs were right. The biggest cataclysms indeed occur every 52 years. The deadliest tornado. In the same year of the cycle, 3 most tragic events happened: a plague, an earthquake, and a volcanic eruption. What other ideas for killing people did the Aztec gods come up with? Maybe a tornado? I think it would not hurt to check it out. As for tornadoes, the 4 most tragic ones occurred in the 20th century. That is not surprising because at the time, there were already billions of people in the world, and thus it was easier to cause a high number of casualties. Earlier tornadoes have no chance to top this ranking. None of these modern tornadoes occurred at the end of the cycle, but I think it would be more meaningful to look at the number of tornado victims relative to the world population in the year of the cataclysm. The deadliest tornado in relation to the world population was the one that struck the Grand Harbor of Malta with great force in the 16th century. It began as a waterspout, sinking 4 galleys and killing over 600 people. There are various dates for this cataclysm, from 1551 to 1556. I carefully checked the sources for these dates and found that the most reliable date for this event is the one found in the book Histoire de Malte from the year 1840. And that is September 23rd, 1555. So this great tornado appeared 3 years and 4 months before the end of the cycle. This is another cataclysm associated with the 52-year cycle of cataclysms. The probability of this all being a coincidence, according to my calculations, drops to 1 in 183,000. It is worth noting that in the same month, when the tornado raged in Malta, a strong earthquake occurred in Kashmir, which also killed 600 people. During that quake, the movements of the Earth's crust were so great that 2 villages were reportedly moved to the other side of the river. Note Also, that both of these cataclysms happened only 4 months before the biggest earthquake, the Shanxi earthquake in 1556. The gods must have been extremely angry at this time. All right, that is all we are covering for this episode. The next episode will be part 3 of chapter 1, the 52-year cycle of cataclysms, and we will be kicking it off with years of cataclysms. Thank you so much for joining in this narration. I'm Chandra Mel, and this is Reset 676.